Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into a remarkable transformation story from ancient history. The life and journey of a man who began as a deceiver and schemer, yet became the father of an entire nation. We're exploring Jacob, whose very name meant supplanter, but who through struggle, exile, and a mysterious wrestling match with the divine, was transformed into Israel, he who wrestles with God. His story of family conflict, divine encounters, and ultimate redemption continues to resonate with millions of people today. So without further ado, let's begin. In the rolling hills of the Negev, where Abraham had once pitched his tents, and where Isaac now grazed his vast flocks, a drama was unfolding that would shape the destiny of nations. The year was approximately 1836 BC, and in the household of Isaac, son of Abraham, a crisis had been brewing for 20 long years. Rebekah, the beautiful woman who had left her family in distant Mesopotamia to marry a man she had never met, pressed her hands against her swollen belly and winced in pain. This was no ordinary pregnancy. Inside her womb, a battle raged with such violence that she feared for her life. The children, for the midwives had confirmed there were two, seemed to be fighting for supremacy even before birth, their struggles so intense that Rebekah wondered if she would survive to see them born. Driven to desperation, she sought the Lord in prayer, crying out for understanding. Why was this happening? What did it mean? The divine response came with startling clarity, a prophecy that would echo through the corridors of history. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. In a world where primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, was as sacred as the covenant itself, this prophecy defied every social and cultural norm. The older serving the younger? It was unprecedented, revolutionary, and would prove to be the defining tension of the next century. When the day of birth finally arrived, the household of Isaac witnessed something extraordinary. The first child emerged red and hairy, as if clothed in a garment of fur, robust and wild even in infancy. They named him Esau, meaning hairy or made, and he seemed destined for strength and action. But as the midwives prepared to cut the cord, they gasped in amazement. A second hand had emerged, gripping tightly to Esau's heel, as if unwilling to accept second place even in the moment of birth. When the second twin finally appeared, smaller and smoother than his brother, his tiny fist still clutched around Esau's heel, they knew immediately what to call him. Jacob, heel grabber, supplanter, the one who seeks to trip up or overtake another. Even in his first moments of life, the younger son seemed to be reaching for what belonged to his brother. Isaac, now 60 years old and long settled into the patient rhythms of a patriarch, looked down at his 2 sons with wonder and perhaps a growing sense of unease. He had heard the prophecy from Rebekah's lips, but how could such a thing come to pass? Esau was everything a father could want in a firstborn. Vigorous, bold, already showing signs of the hunter's instinct that would make him a provider and protector. Jacob, by contrast, seemed contemplative, watchful, his dark eyes already calculating even as an infant. As the boys grew, their differences became as pronounced as day and night. Esau developed into exactly what his birth had promised. A skillful hunter, a man of the open fields, his arms strong from drawing the bow, his feet swift in pursuit of the game. He would disappear for days into the wilderness, returning with fresh venison and wild stories of his adventures. His laugh was loud and infectious, his appetites immediate and intense. He lived fully in each moment, grabbing life with both hands and wringing from it every drop of immediate pleasure. Jacob, meanwhile, became what the Hebrew text calls a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Where Esau roamed the wild places, Jacob remained close to home, learning the intricate arts of shepherding, trade, and household management. He watched, he listened, he calculated. While Esau chased deer across the hills, Jacob studied the stars and learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather, the health of livestock, the movements of neighbouring tribes. The household dynamics that developed around these 2 boys would have been recognisable to any family struggling with favouritism and its consequences. Isaac, perhaps seeing in Esau's bold masculinity an echo of his own father Abraham's adventurous spirit, found himself drawn to his elder son. The taste of fresh game that Esau provided became more than mere nourishment. It represented everything Isaac admired about strength, provision, and masculine achievement. When Esau returned from a successful hunt, Isaac's eyes would light up with paternal pride. Rebekah, however, saw something different in her younger son. Perhaps she remembered the prophecy, or perhaps she simply recognized in Jacob's quiet intelligence the qualities that would be needed to carry forward the covenant promises. She watched him study the movements of the flocks, saw how he could predict weather patterns and grazing needs, noticed his patient way with difficult animals. Where Isaac saw mere domesticity, Rebekah saw the makings of a patriarch. This favoritism created invisible fault lines through the family, tensions that would eventually tear it apart. Esau basked in his father's approval, growing ever more confident in his position as heir apparent. Jacob absorbed his mother's attention and perhaps her ambitions, learning from her the subtle arts of influence and persuasion. Neither boy was inherently evil, but both were being shaped by family dynamics that emphasized competition over cooperation, favoritism over fairness. The birthright that lay between them represented far more than modern readers might understand. In the ancient Near East, the firstborn son's inheritance wasn't simply a matter of receiving a larger portion of the family wealth, though that was certainly part of it. The birthright carried with it the double portion of inheritance, yes, but also the responsibility for family leadership, the obligation to care for aging parents and unmarried sisters, and most significantly in this family, the privilege of carrying forward the covenant promises that God had made to Abraham. These weren't merely material blessings. Through Abraham, God had promised to create a great nation, to bless all the families of the earth through his descendants, to give them a specific land as an eternal inheritance. The birthright meant becoming the conduit through which these cosmic promises would flow to future generations. It meant becoming the ancestor of the Messiah, the father of the chosen people, the link between heaven's purposes and earth's realities. But Esau, for all his admirable qualities, seemed constitutionally incapable of grasping the weight of such spiritual responsibilities. He lived for the immediate, the tangible, the sensual. The abstract promises of future blessings held little appeal for a man whose universe was bounded by the next hunt, the next meal, the next adventure. He was, in many ways, the quintessential man of action, decisive, brave, generous, but also impulsive, short-sighted and ultimately dismissive of anything that couldn't be immediately grasped or consumed. Jacob understood what Esau could not, that the birthright represented power, legacy, and divine favour rolled into one magnificent inheritance. He may not have possessed his brother's physical strength or natural charisma, but he had something perhaps more valuable, the ability to see beyond the present moment to future possibilities. He could envision what it would mean to be the patriarch through whom God's promises flowed to the world. The stage was thus set for a confrontation that had been building since the moment of their birth. Two brothers, two natures, two destinies, all contained within one household, where competing loyalties and divine prophecies created a powder keg waiting for the right spark. That spark would come on an ordinary day, in the most mundane of circumstances, over something as simple as a bowl of stew. The day itself seemed unremarkable. Esau had been hunting for several days in the wilderness south of Beersheba, tracking a herd of gazelles that had proven frustratingly elusive. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his water supply had run lower than expected. When he finally admitted defeat and turned toward home, his stomach was cramping with hunger, his throat parched with thirst, his pride wounded by his failure to provide. Meanwhile, Jacob had spent the day in the familiar rhythms of camp life. He had checked on the pregnant ewes, negotiated with traders passing through on their way to Egypt, and as evening approached, he had prepared a meal of red lentils, seasoned with the herbs and spices that he knew how to blend for maximum flavour. The aroma wafting from the cooking pot was rich and inviting, the deep red colour of the stew gleaming like liquid garnets in the firelight. When Esau stumbled into camp, exhausted and famished, that aroma hit him like a physical blow. His hunter's pride evaporated in the face of his body's immediate need. Here was his brother, as always, in the right place at the right time with exactly what Esau desperately wanted. The irony was palpable. The great hunter reduced to begging from the tent dweller, the provider needing to be provided for. "Give me some of that red stew," Esau demanded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and need. "I'm famished." The Hebrew text captures his desperation with brutal honesty. He was quite literally dying of hunger and thirst. Jacob looked up from his cooking, and in that moment saw opportunity crystallizing before him like dew forming at dawn. Here was Esau, the favoured son, the heir apparent, reduced to desperate need. Here was the birthright holder, brought low by his own impulsiveness and poor planning. For someone who had spent his entire life being second, overlooked in a favour of his more dramatic brother, the moment must have felt like vindication. "Sell me your birthright first," Jacob replied, his voice steady, his offer presented as matter-of-factly as a merchant proposing a simple trade. The request hung in the air between them. Both brothers understood exactly what was being proposed. This wasn't merely about a meal in exchange for some abstract future inheritance. This was about the complete reversal of their destinies, the fulfillment of the prophecy their mother had received before their birth, the trading away of everything that made Esau the heir and Jacob the spare. Esau, his judgment clouded by hunger and his characteristic impulsiveness, overwhelming any capacity for long-term thinking, spoke the words that would echo through history. "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" In that moment of weakness, he revealed the fundamental difference between himself and his brother. Where Jacob could see the eternal significance of the birthright, Esau could see only its irrelevance to his immediate needs. "Swear to me first," Jacob insisted, understanding that in their culture, an oath was binding and sacred. This wouldn't be a casual promise that could be taken back when Esau's hunger was satisfied and his regret set in. This would be a formal transfer, as legal and irreversible as any document written on parchment. Esau swore the oath. For a bowl of red lentil stew and some bread, he sold his birthright to his younger brother. The text records with stark simplicity, "Thus Esau despised his birthright." Not just sold it, not just traded it away in a moment of weakness, but despised it, treated it as worthless beneath his notice, unworthy of preservation. Jacob ladled the stew into a bowl and tore off fresh bread, watching as his brother ate with the desperate hunger of a man who had been truly famished. But even as Esau satisfied his immediate need, something had shifted in the cosmic order. The prophecy was beginning its fulfillment. The older was beginning his journey towards serving the younger, though neither brother yet understood the full implications of what had just transpired. As Esau wiped his mouth and walked away, satisfied, and perhaps already beginning to forget the oath he had sworn, Jacob remained by the cooking fire, stirring the remaining stew and contemplating what he had just accomplished. He had waited for this moment his entire life, watching for the opportunity when his brother's impulsiveness would create an opening for his own patient cunning to exploit. Yet even in his moment of triumph, Jacob couldn't have foreseen the price he would pay for this victory. He had gained the birthright through cleverness and opportunism, but he had also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually drive him from his family, cost him decades of exile, and force him to confront the deeper questions of whether God's promises could truly be grasped through human manipulation, or required a different kind of surrender altogether. The red stew would give Esau a nickname that would stick for the rest of his life, Edom meaning red, and it would also give Jacob his first taste of what it meant to take by cunning what others held by right. It was a pattern that would define his early years, the brilliant strategist who could see opportunities that others missed, but who had not yet learned that some victories come at too high a price. In the tents of Isaac that night, two brothers went to sleep with very different thoughts occupying their minds. Esau, his hunger satisfied and his immediate needs met, probably gave little thought to the oath he had sworn. The birthright had always seemed to him like an abstract concept anyway, a burden of future responsibilities that interfered with his enjoyment of present pleasures. Jacob, however, lay awake long into the night, turning over in his mind what he had gained and what it might cost him. He now possessed the birthright, but he knew that possession and recognition were two different things. His father still favoured Esau, still saw in the elder son the natural heir to Abraham's legacy. The birthright might be legally Jacob's now, but the blessing, the formal, public, paternal confirmation of inheritance and destiny, that still lay in his father's hands, and Jacob, even in his moment of triumph, understood that his struggle was far from over. If anything, it had only just begun. Years passed in the household of Isaac, and the stolen birthright remained like a hidden fault line beneath the surface of family life. Esau seemed to have forgotten entirely about his oath over the red stew, continuing to live as if nothing had changed, hunting with the same enthusiasm, enjoying his father's favour with the same easy confidence. But Jacob never forgot. The birthright was his by law and oath, yet he understood with growing clarity that legal possession meant nothing without his father's recognition and blessing. Isaac had grown old, not just in years, but in the way that age settles into a man's bones and dims his senses. The patriarch who had once dug wells and negotiated with Philistine kings now spent his days in his tent, his once sharp eyes clouded with cataracts, his hearing diminished, his hands trembling with the palsy of advanced age. He knew, with the instinctive awareness that comes to those approaching their final season, that his time was drawing short. In the ancient world, a father's deathbed blessing carried weight that modern minds can barely comprehend. This wasn't merely an emotional farewell or expression of paternal love. It was a legal and spiritual transfer of authority, inheritance, and destiny. The words spoken in blessing were believed to carry prophetic power, shaping the future of the recipient and their descendants for generations to come. For Isaac, the son of Abraham and inheritor of God's covenant promises, this blessing represented the formal passing of divine favour from one generation to the next. On a day that seemed ordinary in every respect except for its ultimate consequences, Isaac called for his elder son. "My son," he said to Esau, his voice carrying the weight of patriarchal authority, despite its physical frailty. "Behold, I am old. I don't know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me delicious food such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die." It was a reasonable request, entirely in keeping with family tradition. Esau had always been the provider of fresh meat, and Isaac had always delighted in the savoury dishes his elder son prepared from his hunting expeditions. The ritual made perfect sense, a final shared meal between father and heir, followed by the solemn transfer of patriarchal blessing. What Isaac couldn't have anticipated was that every word of this conversation was being overheard by his wife. Rebekah, now elderly herself, but still possessed of the sharp intelligence that had once prompted her to offer water to Abraham's servant and his camels, heard Isaac's words and felt something like panic grip her heart. She had never forgotten the prophecy received before her son's birth. The older shall serve the younger, and she had watched for decades as Isaac's favoritism toward Esau seemed to make that divine promise increasingly impossible. Perhaps she had always expected that God would somehow intervene to ensure Jacob received the blessing that prophecy demanded. Perhaps she'd convinced herself that Isaac would eventually recognize Jacob's superior character and suitability for spiritual leadership. But now, with Isaac preparing to formally bless Esau, she realized that divine promises sometimes required human cooperation and human cunning to reach their fulfillment. As soon as Esau departed for his hunting expedition, bow in hand and quiver on his shoulder, Rebekah moved into action with the decisive efficiency of a general implementing a battle plan. She had been Isaac's wife for decades. She knew his routines, his preferences, his diminished capacities. If the blessing was going to go to the right son, the son chosen by divine prophecy, then she would have to ensure it happened. "I heard your father speak to your brother Esau," she told Jacob urgently. "Now therefore, my son, obey my voice as I command you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 good young goats, so that I may prepare from them delicious food for your father such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." Jacob, despite years of scheming and calculation, felt his confidence waver in the face of such a bold deception. This wasn't the patient opportunism that had won him the birthright. This was active fraud, deliberate impersonation, a scheme that could backfire catastrophically if discovered. "Behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a smooth man," he protested. "Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him and bring a curse upon myself and not a blessing." But Rebekah had thought of everything. "Let your curse be on me, my son," she replied with fierce determination. "Only obey my voice and go. Bring them to me." She was willing to risk divine judgment to see the prophecy fulfilled, to ensure that the blessing went to the son she believed deserved it. What followed was perhaps the most elaborate deception in biblical history. Rebekah took the choicest young goats from their flock and prepared them exactly as Isaac preferred, seasoned with the herbs and spices that would mask any difference in flavour from wild game. She took Esau's best garments, the ones that carried his distinctive scent of open fields and leather and wood smoke, and dressed Jacob in them. Most ingeniously, she took the skins of the freshly killed goats and bound them around Jacob's hands and neck, creating a texture that might fool Isaac's failing touch. Jacob looked at himself and must have felt like a man wearing a costume for a play he wasn't sure he wanted to perform in. The goat skins were warm and slightly damp against his smooth skin. Esau's clothes hung differently on his smaller frame, and the carefully prepared food smelled rich and inviting in his hands. He was about to impersonate his brother to their blind father, steal a blessing that belonged to another, and set in motion consequences he couldn't begin to predict. When Jacob entered his father's tent carrying the meal and wearing his brother's identity, the dim interior seemed charged with tension. Isaac lay on his bed, his sightless eyes turned toward the sound of approaching footsteps, his other senses heightened by his visual impairment. "My father," Jacob said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid detection. "Here I am," Isaac replied. "Who are you, my son?" The moment of truth had arrived. Jacob opened his mouth and spoke the lie that would change everything. "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that your soul may bless me." But Isaac, despite his physical limitations, was no fool. Something about the encounter felt wrong from the beginning. "How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son?" he asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. Jacob, committed now to the deception, replied smoothly, "Because the Lord your God granted me success." Even in his blindness, Isaac sensed inconsistencies. The timeline seemed too rapid. Esau had only just departed, yet here he was, claiming to have hunted, killed, field-dressed, and cooked game in what seemed like an impossibly short time. "Come near, that I may feel you, my son," Isaac commanded, "to know whether you are really my son Esau or not." Jacob's heart must have hammered against his ribs as he approached his father's bed. Everything depended on this moment. The goatskins had to convince, his disguise had to hold, his nerve had to remain steady. Isaac's weathered hands, still strong despite his age, reached out and carefully examined Jacob's hands and arms. Texture was right. Hairy. Rough. Unmistakably like Esau's. But something else troubled the old patriarch. "The voice is Jacob's voice," he murmured, more to himself than to his son, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." For a long moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity, Isaac's hands continued their examination, his mind wrestling with conflicting sensory information. Finally he asked directly, "Are you really my son, Esau?" "I am," Jacob lied, the words falling from his lips like stones into deep water. Partially convinced but still uneasy, Isaac requested the meal. Jacob served him the carefully prepared goat meat, seasoned to perfection, accompanied by bread and wine. Isaac ate slowly, savouring flavours that seemed familiar yet somehow different. When he'd finished, he made one final test. "Come near and kiss me, my son," he said. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment of all. Jacob leaned close enough that Isaac could smell Esau's garments, could feel the texture of the disguised skin, could sense the physical presence of the person claiming to be his elder son. The scent of the fields that clung to Esau's clothing filled Isaac's nostrils, and finally his doubts began to fade. What happened next would reverberate through history. Isaac placed his hands on what he believed was Esau's head and spoke the patriarchal blessing, words that carried the weight of divine covenant and paternal authority. "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you." Each word fell like a hammer blow, sealing Jacob's destiny and simultaneously sealing Esau's fate. The blessing spoke of agricultural abundance, political dominance, international recognition, and divine protection. Most significantly, it established the younger son as a lord over his brothers, a direct fulfillment of the ancient prophecy, achieved through human deception, yet somehow still advancing divine purposes. Jacob received the blessing in silence, perhaps overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had just accomplished, perhaps already beginning to sense the price he would pay for this victory. As soon as Isaac finished speaking, Jacob hurried from the tent, still wearing his brother's clothes, still carrying the scent of the field that had helped convince his father. He had barely disappeared from sight when the sound of approaching footsteps announced another arrival. Esau returned from his hunting expedition, successful this time, carrying fresh venison and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had provided well for his family. He prepared the meat with the skill of long practice, seasoning it exactly as his father preferred, anticipating the pleasure he would bring to Isaac and the blessing he would receive in return. "Let my father arise and eat of his son's game," Esau announced cheerfully as he entered Isaac's tent, "that your soul may bless me." The words hit Isaac like a physical blow. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp with alarm. "I am your son, your firstborn Esau," came the confident reply. Isaac began to tremble violently, the terrible truth crashing over him in waves. "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." The revelation that he had been deceived, that he had given the irreversible patriarchal blessing to the wrong son, that his own diminished senses had been exploited to subvert his intentions, it all combined to create a moment of shock that left the old patriarch shaking like a man in the grip of fever. Esau's reaction was even more devastating. When he understood what had happened, when he realized that his brother had stolen not just his birthright, but now his blessing as well, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry. The Hebrew text conveys anguish beyond mere disappointment. This was the sound of a man watching his entire future collapse in a single moment. "Bless me, even me also, O my father," Esau pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. Isaac, still trembling from the shock of discovery, could only explain the finality of what had occurred. "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." The words carried the weight of legal and spiritual reality. What had been spoken could not be unspoken. What had been blessed could not be unblessed. "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Esau cried out, the bitter irony of his brother's name now fully apparent. "For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." But even in his anguish, Esau's heart held hope for some remnant of paternal favour. "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" he asked. Isaac's response revealed the totality of what Jacob had received. "Behold, I have made him lord over you, and all his brothers I have given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I have sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?" The blessing Isaac could offer Esau was a shadow of what Jacob had received. He would live by his sword, serve his brother, but someday break free from that servitude. It was something, but it was not the patriarchal blessing, not the covenant inheritance, not the destiny that should have been his by right of birth. As the full implications of Jacob's deception settled over the household, Esau's grief began to transform into something darker and more dangerous. "The days of mourning for my father are at hand," he said to himself. "Then I will kill my brother Jacob." It wasn't an empty threat spoken in the heat of anger. It was a carefully calculated decision. He would observe the proper period of mourning when Isaac died, fulfill his filial duties, and then he would have his revenge. Word of Esau's murderous intent reached Rebekah through the network of servants and family members who made up their extended household. The woman who had engineered Jacob's triumph now realized that her cleverness had put her favorite son's life in mortal danger. The blessing had been won, but at a cost that threatened to destroy everything she had fought to preserve. "Now therefore, my son," she told Jacob urgently, "obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban my brother in Haran, and stay with him a while, until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him." She presented the plan to Isaac as a matter of finding Jacob a suitable wife from among their relatives, rather than from the local Canaanite women, a concern that would resonate with Isaac's own memories of how Abraham had insisted on finding Rebekah from among their kinspeople. But both she and Jacob understood the real reason for his sudden departure. He was fleeing for his life, an exile from the very blessing he had fought so hard to obtain. Jacob's victory was complete and devastating in equal measure. He possessed both the birthright and the blessing, the legal inheritance and the spiritual authority that made him Isaac's true heir. He had outmaneuvered his brother, fulfilled ancient prophecy, and secured his position as the next patriarch in the line of Abraham. Yet as he prepared to leave the only home he had ever known, carrying minimal provisions for a journey that might last years or even decades, Jacob must have wondered if his triumph was worth its price. He had gained everything he thought he wanted, but in doing so he had lost his family, his security and his peace. He was leaving as a fugitive, wealthy in divine promises but poor in human relationships, blessed by heaven but cursed by the brother whose birthright and blessing he had stolen. The sun was setting as Jacob took his last look at the tents of Isaac, at the wells Abraham had dug, at the grazing lands where he had spent his youth learning the arts of shepherding and husbandry. Behind him lay everything familiar and secure. Ahead lay the unknown wilderness, a dangerous journey to a distant relative he had never met, and an uncertain future in a foreign land. As he shouldered his pack and set his face toward the northeast, toward the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, where his grandfather Abraham had been born, and where his mother's family still dwelt, Jacob carried with him more than mere possessions. He bore the weight of promises stolen and oaths broken, of a brother's hatred and a mother's desperate love, of divine blessing obtained through human deception. He had spent his entire life being the clever one, the planner, the strategist who could see opportunities that others missed and exploit them with patience and skill. But as the familiar landmarks of his homeland disappeared behind him, and the vast emptiness of the wilderness opened before him, Jacob began to understand that cleverness alone might not be enough for the journey ahead. The young man who had grasped his brother's heel in the womb and never let go of his ambition to be first was about to discover that some lessons can only be learned in exile, some victories can only be won through defeat, and some blessings can only be received when we finally stop trying to seize them through our own strength and cunning. Behind him, in the tents of Isaac, Esau nursed his hatred and planned his revenge, waiting for the day when he could reclaim his honour and settle accounts with the brother who had twice stolen what should have been his. Ahead lay Haran, where Jacob would encounter his own master manipulator in his uncle Laban, and where he would learn firsthand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of deception. But first, on a night that would change everything, under stars that had witnessed the promises made to Abraham and the covenant sealed with Isaac, Jacob would have an encounter that would transform his understanding of who he was and who he was meant to become. The heel grabber was about to meet the God whose blessing could not be stolen, only received. The journey to Haran stretched ahead of Jacob like an accusation. Each step carried him further from everything he had known, deeper into a wilderness that seemed to mirror the desolation growing in his heart. The road to Mesopotamia was ancient even in his time, worn smooth by countless caravans carrying goods between the civilizations of the Nile and the Euphrates, but Jacob travelled it alone, without the protection of numbers or the comfort of companions. He had left Beersheba with the dawn, hoping to put as much distance as possible between himself and his brother's wrath, before Esau returned from hunting to discover what had transpired. The weight of his deception hung on him like a physical burden, heavier than the pack on his shoulders or the walking staff in his hand. Every backward glance carried the fear that he might see dust clouds on the horizon, marking Esau's pursuit. Every night brought dreams haunted by his brother's voice crying out that bitter lament, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." For decades, Jacob had believed that success meant getting what you wanted through superior strategy and cunning. He had outmaneuvered Esau at every turn, first claiming the birthright through patient opportunism, then seizing the blessing through elaborate deception. By every measure he had once valued, he should have felt triumphant. Instead, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on his first day of exile, he felt something closer to emptiness. The landscape around him reflected his internal desolation. This was the wilderness of Judea, a harsh country of limestone hills and sparse vegetation, where water was precious and shelter scarce. Abraham had travelled this same route generations earlier when God first called him out of Ur of the Chaldeans. But Abraham had journeyed toward promise and divine calling. Jacob was fleeing consequences, running from the wreckage of relationships destroyed by his own ambition. As darkness fell, Jacob found himself near a place that seemed utterly unremarkable. A rocky hillside dotted with stones, no different from 1,000 other such places in the wilderness. There was no oasis here, no spring of fresh water, no natural shelter from the wind that was beginning to carry the chill of desert night. It was simply where exhaustion and darkness converged to force a halt to his journey. He gathered some of the scattered stones to create a rough windbreak and selected one of the smoother rocks to serve as a pillow. The irony would not have been lost on him. The heir to Abraham's vast wealth, the recipient of Isaac's most powerful blessing, reduced to sleeping on the ground with nothing but stone for comfort. He who had schemed to live in luxury was learning the harder lessons that came with getting what he thought he wanted. As Jacob settled onto the hard ground, pulling his cloak around him against the growing cold, his mind churned with regret, fear, and uncertainty. Behind him lay a brother who wanted him dead, and a father who now knew the depth of his deception. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of dangerous travel to reach relatives he'd never met, who might or might not welcome the nephew of their sister Rebecca. He possessed the birthright and the blessing, but he was discovering that divine promises felt remarkably cold comfort when you were alone in the wilderness, with no clear path forward. Sleep, when it finally came, brought with it the most extraordinary vision in the long history of divine encounters with humanity. Jacob found himself in a dream that was more real than waking life, more vivid than any experience his conscious mind had ever processed. Before him rose a stairway or ladder. The Hebrew word suggests something massive and architectural, perhaps like the great ziggurats that dominated Mesopotamian cities, stretching from the earth where he lay all the way to the very gates of heaven itself. But this was no empty monument to human ambition. The stairway teemed with activity as angels of God ascended and descended in constant motion, creating a highway of communication between the earthly and divine realms. These weren't the cherubic figures of later art, but powerful spiritual beings, messengers and servants of the Most High, going about the business of implementing heaven's will on earth. At the top of this celestial stairway stood a figure that Jacob somehow knew, despite never having seen him before, was the Lord God himself, not in the fullness of his glory, which no mortal could survive, but in a form that Jacob's mind could process without being utterly destroyed. When God spoke, his voice carried the authority of the one who had called the universe into existence. Yet it was also intimate, personal, directed specifically to the fugitive lying on the rocky ground. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac," the voice declared, establishing both identity and continuity. This was not some unknown deity reaching out to Jacob, but the same God who had called Abraham from Ur, who had provided a ram in place of Isaac on Mount Moriah, who had been the source of every blessing the family had known for generations. What came next must have staggered Jacob with its implications. Rather than the condemnation he might have expected for his deception, rather than judgment for the way he had manipulated his way into the blessing, God spoke words of promise and confirmation that exceeded anything Jacob could have imagined. "The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring," God declared, promising not just temporary refuge but permanent inheritance. "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south, and in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." These were the same promises that had been made to Abraham and confirmed to Isaac, but now they were being spoken directly to Jacob, the deceiver, the fugitive, the younger son who had stolen his way into blessing. God was not rejecting him for his methods. Instead, he was confirming that Jacob was indeed the chosen heir, the one through whom the ancient promises would flow to future generations. But perhaps most remarkably, God added a promise that was specifically tailored to Jacob's immediate situation. "Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Jacob was not alone in his exile. The God of his fathers was going with him into the unknown, would protect him in foreign lands, and would ultimately bring him home. The journey that had seemed like punishment was being reframed as pilgrimage. The exile that had felt like abandonment was being revealed as divine accompaniment. When Jacob awoke from the dream, He was no longer the same man who had lain down on the rocky ground hours earlier. The encounter had shattered his understanding of himself and his situation. "Surely the Lord is in this place," he whispered in awe, "and I did not know it." The unremarkable hillside had been transformed in his perception. This wasn't just another camping spot in the wilderness. It was a place where heaven and earth intersected, where the divine presence had chosen to manifest itself to a fleeing fugitive. Fear gripped him, but it was the kind of fear that comes from encountering something infinitely greater than yourself. Not the terror of danger, but the overwhelming awe of standing in the presence of ultimate reality. "How awesome is this place!" he exclaimed. "This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." The transformation in Jacob's perspective was immediate and dramatic. The stone that had served as his uncomfortable pillow became a sacred monument. He set it up as a pillar, anointing it with oil he carried for his journey, marking the spot where God had chosen to reveal himself. He named the place Bethel, House of God, recognizing that he had encountered the divine presence in the last place he would have expected to find it. But Jacob's response to the vision revealed that his character transformation was still a work in progress. Even as he stood in awe of what he had experienced, his calculating mind was already working to turn divine grace into human advantage. The vow he made showed both genuine reverence and his persistent tendency to treat even God as a potential negotiating partner. "If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God," Jacob declared. "And this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house, and of all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you." The conditional nature of his vow, "if God will do this, then I will do that," revealed that Jacob was still thinking in terms of bargains and transactions rather than grace and relationship. He was treating the God of Abraham like a business partner, offering loyalty and tithing in exchange for protection and provision. Yet even this flawed response represented progress. For the first time in his life, Jacob was acknowledging a power greater than his own cleverness, a source of blessing that couldn't be manipulated or stolen. The vision at Bethel marked the true beginning of Jacob's spiritual journey. Until this moment, he had been the architect of his own destiny, the clever younger son who could outthink and outmaneuver anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. The birthright had been won through opportunism, the blessing through deception, both victories that reinforced his belief that success came through superior strategy. But the dream shattered that self-reliant worldview. Here was blessing that came not because he had earned it or stolen it, but because God had chosen to give it. Here were promises that depended not on Jacob's cleverness but on divine faithfulness. Here was protection offered not because he deserved it, but because God had committed himself to the covenant made with Abraham. As dawn broke over the hills of Bethel, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob resumed his journey with a fundamentally altered understanding of his situation. He was still in exile, still fleeing his brother's wrath, still facing years of uncertainty in a foreign land. But he was no longer travelling alone. The God of his fathers had committed to journey with him, to protect him, and ultimately to bring him home. The road to Haran stretched ahead, hundreds of miles of difficult travel through territories controlled by various tribes and city-states. But Jacob's steps now carried a confidence that had nothing to do with his own abilities. He had met the God who could not be deceived or manipulated, who knew exactly what Jacob had done and why, yet who had chosen to bless rather than condemn, to promise rather than punish. Yet even as he walked toward his destiny, Jacob remained Jacob, the supplanter, the strategist, the man who instinctively looked for angles and advantages in every situation. The encounter at Bethel had begun his transformation, but it had not completed it. That would require years of experience, seasons of hardship, and ultimately a wrestling match that would change not just his name, but his fundamental nature. For now, it was enough that he had learned the most important lesson of his life. There was a God who was greater than his schemes, who could accomplish his purposes through human weakness, as easily as through human strength, who could transform even deception into the fulfillment of divine prophecy. The heel-grabber was beginning his journey toward becoming Israel, but the road would be longer and more difficult than anything he could imagine. Behind him lay the ashes of broken relationships, and the consequences of choices that had seemed so clever at the time. Ahead lay Laban, a master manipulator who would teach Jacob what it felt like to be on the receiving end of deception. But above him, invisible yet somehow tangible after his vision at Bethel, was the presence of the God who had promised to be with him wherever he went. It was this presence, more than any human cleverness or strength, that would carry him through the trials ahead and ultimately bring him home transformed. The journey to Haran took Jacob through landscapes that shifted like the pages of an ancient geography text. He crossed the Jordan River where it wound through green valleys, climbed the heights of Gilead where cedars grew tall and straight, and traversed the Syrian plains where nomadic tribes moved their flocks in endless cycles following grass and water. Each mile carried him further from the land of promise and deeper into the world his grandfather Abraham had left behind at God's command. After weeks of travel, dusty and travel-worn, Jacob finally approached the ancient city of Haran. This was Mesopotamian civilization at its height, a crossroads of trade routes where merchants from Babylon and Assyria met those travelling from Egypt and Canaan. The city's ziggurat rose against the sky like a man-made mountain, testament to the engineering prowess of peoples who had built cities when Jacob's ancestors were still nomads. Yet for all its grandeur, Haran remained a place of exile for the heir of Abraham's promises. It was at a well outside the city that Jacob's destiny took another unexpected turn. Wells in the ancient world were more than mere sources of water. They were social centres, meeting places where news was exchanged and relationships formed. This particular well was covered by a large stone that required multiple shepherds working together to remove it, a practical arrangement that prevented any single person from monopolising the water source. Jacob arrived at midday to find 3 flocks of sheep lying nearby, their shepherds resting in whatever shade they could find while waiting for others to arrive. The stone covering the well was massive, clearly designed to require communal effort to move. As Jacob approached, travel-weary and uncertain, he struck up conversation with the shepherds in the casual way of travellers seeking information. "My brothers, where are you from?" he asked. "We are from Haran," they replied. Jacob's pulse quickened. "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" "We know him," came the answer. "Is it well with him?" "It is well," they said, and then added words that would change Jacob's life. "See, Rachel his daughter is coming with the sheep." Jacob looked in the direction they pointed and saw her approaching. A young woman leading her father's flock toward the well, moving with the confident grace of someone comfortable with responsibility and hard work. Even at a distance, something about her struck Jacob with immediate force. Perhaps it was her bearing, perhaps the way she managed the sheep with gentle authority, perhaps simply the knowledge that here was his own cousin, flesh of his flesh, the first family connection he had encountered in weeks of lonely travel. What happened next revealed that Jacob's encounter with God at Bethel, while spiritually significant, had not diminished his capacity for dramatic gestures when properly motivated. As Rachel approached the well, Jacob did something that shocked the other shepherds, and probably surprised himself. Instead of waiting for more shepherds to arrive to help move the stone through communal effort, he stepped forward and single-handedly rolled away the massive covering. The feat required strength Jacob didn't know he possessed, fueled by emotions he didn't fully understand. Here was divine provision in human form, not just water for his thirst, but connection to family, hope for acceptance, possibility for belonging in this foreign land. The stone that had seemed immovable to the gathered shepherds yielded to Jacob's adrenaline-powered effort, like a cork from a bottle. He watered Rachel's flock first, then turned to face the young woman who would become the centre of his emotional universe for the rest of his life. When he told her that he was her father's kinsman, the son of Rebekah, Rachel's face lit with recognition and welcome. Family connections in the ancient world carried obligations and privileges that modern individualism can barely comprehend. To find previously unknown relatives was to discover instant belonging, mutual responsibility, and expanded possibilities. But Jacob's response to meeting Rachel went far beyond family duty or social convention. The text records with striking simplicity that Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. Here was the calculating strategist, the man who had manipulated his way to birthright and blessing, reduced to tears by an encounter with genuine love. For the first time in his life, Jacob experienced the overwhelming emotion of meeting someone he wanted to protect and cherish, rather than outmaneuver and defeat. Rachel ran to tell her father Laban of Jacob's arrival, and soon the older man appeared to welcome his nephew with the elaborate hospitality that marked ancient Near Eastern culture. Laban embraced Jacob, kissed him, and brought him into his house, listening with apparent fascination as Jacob recounted the story of his journey and the circumstances that had brought him to Haran. "Surely you are my bone and my flesh," Laban declared after hearing Jacob's account. The phrase carried deep significance. It wasn't merely acknowledging family relationship, but was declaring Jacob to be fully accepted into the household, entitled to protection and support, as if he were Laban's own son. Jacob remained with Laban for a month, during which time he threw himself into the work of shepherding and household management with all the skill he had learned in his father's house. He understood sheep and goats, could predict weather patterns, knew how to maximize grazing efficiency, and protect flocks from predators. Laban quickly recognized that his nephew possessed valuable abilities that could significantly benefit the family enterprise. It was after this month of evaluation that Laban made an offer that seemed generous on its surface. "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" The question gave Jacob the opening he had been hoping for. During his month in Laban's household, he had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Rachel. She was beautiful, certainly. The text describes her as beautiful in form and appearance. But Jacob's attraction went deeper than mere physical appeal. In Rachel, he had found someone whose spirit matched his own, whose intelligence complemented his, whose presence made the exile from his homeland feel less like punishment and more like preparation for a new kind of life. "I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter," Jacob proposed. It was an extraordinary offer. 7 years of labour represented enormous value, the work of a skilled shepherd and manager, freely given in exchange for a bride. In a culture where bride prices were typically paid in livestock or precious metals, Jacob was offering something far more valuable: his prime working years, his expertise, his complete dedication to building Laban's wealth. Laban's response seemed to seal the bargain with familial warmth. "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." Yet even in accepting the proposal, there were subtle signs that might have warned a less love-struck negotiator. Laban didn't explicitly agree to the terms. He simply suggested that Jacob stay, leaving the specifics deliberately vague. But Jacob was too much in love to notice such subtleties. For the first time in his life, he had found something he wanted more than advantage or position or inheritance. Rachel represented the possibility of genuine partnership, of building something together rather than taking something from someone else. The 7 years of labour didn't feel like servitude. They felt like investment in a future that would be built on love rather than manipulation. The text captures Jacob's emotional state with beautiful simplicity. The 7 years seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Here was Jacob, the schemer transformed by love, into Jacob, the devoted suitor, willing to work without wages, to give the best years of his life for the privilege of calling Rachel his wife. During those 7 years, Jacob proved himself to be everything Laban could have hoped for in a kinsman and employee. The flocks multiplied under his care, the household prospered through his management, and Laban's wealth increased significantly through his nephew's expertise. Jacob learned the landscape of northern Mesopotamia, developed relationships with neighbouring shepherds and traders, and became an integral part of the community around Haran. He also had the opportunity to observe Laban closely, and what he saw should have prepared him for what was coming. His uncle was a master of verbal misdirection, someone who could make promises that seemed generous while leaving himself maximum flexibility in their interpretation. Laban was charming, hospitable, and utterly unscrupulous, a man who viewed every relationship as an opportunity for advantage and every agreement as subject to revision based on changing circumstances. But Jacob, blinded by love, and perhaps by the confidence that came from his past successes in manipulation, failed to recognize that he was dealing with someone whose skills in deception exceeded even his own. He had spent his life being the smartest person in any negotiation, the one who saw angles that others missed. He wasn't prepared to encounter someone who could out-scheme the schemer. When the 7 years were complete, Jacob approached Laban with the confidence of a man who had fulfilled his obligations completely and expected to receive what had been promised. "Give me my wife that I may go into her, for my time is completed," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of work well done and contracts honoured. Laban agreed with apparent enthusiasm, organising a wedding feast that brought together the entire community. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, weddings were elaborate affairs lasting multiple days, featuring abundant food and drink, music and dancing, and rituals that formally recognised the union before all the local authorities and witnesses. Nothing about Laban's preparations suggested deception. Quite the opposite. Everything pointed to a generous father celebrating his daughter's marriage to a worthy man. The wedding feast proceeded exactly as Jacob had anticipated. The food was abundant, the wine flowed freely, and the celebration continued late into the night. When the time finally came for the bride to be brought to Jacob's tent, she appeared heavily veiled in the manner appropriate for a modest bride, accompanied by female attendants who helped conduct her to where Jacob waited. In the darkness of the tent, with his judgment clouded by wine and his senses overwhelmed by the fulfillment of 7 years of waiting, Jacob consummated what he believed was his marriage to Rachel. The veils, the darkness, and the excitement of the moment prevented him from recognizing the deception being perpetrated upon him. He went to sleep that night believing that he had finally achieved the love and partnership he had worked so hard to earn. Dawn brought revelation as devastating as any in human history. When morning light filtered into the tent and Jacob turned to look upon his bride's face, he found himself staring not at Rachel, but at her older sister Leah. The shock was total and immediate. Jacob had been deceived as completely as he had once deceived his own father, manipulated by someone whose skills in misdirection exceeded even his own considerable abilities. The 7 years of faithful service, the elaborate wedding celebration, the carefully orchestrated rituals, all had been designed to mask a substitution as audacious as any Jacob had ever attempted. "What is this you have done to me?" Jacob confronted Laban, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban's response was masterful in its combination of cultural justification and implicit rebuke. "It is not so done in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Here was his own strategy thrown back in his face, his own disregard for birth order reflected in his uncle's explanation. Laban was essentially saying, "You, who stole your older brother's birthright and blessing, should understand why I cannot give my younger daughter before her older sister." The irony was devastating. Jacob was experiencing firsthand the same violation of natural order that he had inflicted on Esau. But Laban, ever the negotiator, wasn't finished. "Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. The offer was breathtaking in its audacity. Laban was proposing to give Jacob Rachel as well, but only after another 7 years of unpaid labour. He was essentially doubling the bride price while making it seem like a generous accommodation to Jacob's desires. It was manipulation so skillful that it made Jacob's own deception seem amateurish by comparison. Jacob found himself trapped by his own love and his uncle's superior cunning. He could reject the offer and leave Haran, but that would mean abandoning Rachel forever. He could demand Rachel immediately, but he had no leverage. Laban held all the cards in this negotiation. The master manipulator had been outmaneuvered by an even greater master. Jacob did so and completed her week, the text records. He accepted Laban's terms, consummated his marriage to Leah, and committed himself to another 7 years of service for the privilege of marrying the woman he actually loved. A week later, Rachel also became his wife, but at a cost that had doubled beyond anything he had originally imagined. The household that resulted from this arrangement was a powder keg of emotional tension and competing loyalties. Jacob loved Rachel with the same intensity that had motivated his 7 years of service, but she remained barren while Leah, the unloved wife, proved remarkably fertile. The situation created a dynamic of competition and resentment that would define Jacob's family life for decades to come. Leah bore son after son, each birth representing her desperate attempt to win her husband's love through providing him with heirs. Reuben, whose name meant sea, a son, reflected Leah's hope that Jacob would finally notice and appreciate her. Simeon, meaning heard, showed her belief that God had heard her cry for recognition. Levi, attached, expressed her hope that this child would finally attach Jacob's heart to her. Judah, praise, marked a moment when she seemed to find peace in praising God regardless of her husband's feelings. Meanwhile, Rachel's barrenness became a source of growing desperation. She was loved but could not fulfill the primary function expected of wives in ancient culture, producing heirs to carry on the family name and inheritance. The competition between the sisters escalated as each sought to prove her worth through childbearing, eventually involving their servants Bilhah and Zilpah in the contest to produce more sons for Jacob. During these years of domestic complexity, Jacob learned lessons about the consequences of deception that no amount of success in his father's household could have taught him. He experienced what it meant to be the victim rather than the perpetrator of manipulation, to have his trust betrayed by someone he had served faithfully, to discover that even love could be used as a weapon against him. Yet even as Jacob suffered under Laban's continued manipulations, changes to his wages, alterations to their agreements, constant revisions of terms that always seemed to favour Laban, God's blessing remained evident on his life. The flocks prospered under his care in ways that defied natural explanation. His understanding of animal husbandry, combined with what seemed to be divine favour, resulted in increases that made Laban wealthy beyond his wildest expectations. Jacob developed innovative breeding techniques, using visual stimuli and selective breeding practices that maximized the health and productivity of the flocks. When Laban tried to cheat him by claiming all the solid-coloured animals as wages, Jacob's flocks produced unusual numbers of spotted and speckled offspring. When the terms were changed to favour spotted animals, solid colours dominated the births. It was as if the God who had promised to be with Jacob wherever he went was ensuring that no human manipulation could ultimately thwart the prosperity promised to Abraham's heir. The years in Haran were transforming Jacob in ways that went far beyond accumulating wealth or learning new skills. He was experiencing humility for the first time, the humbling recognition that he was not the smartest person in every room, that others could play the games of deception and manipulation even better than he could. He was learning patience, not the calculated patience of waiting for opportunity, but the deeper patience of enduring circumstances beyond his control. Most importantly, he was beginning to understand the pain that his own deceptions had caused. When he looked into Leah's eyes and saw the hurt of being unloved despite her faithfulness, he was seeing a reflection of the pain he had caused Esau. When he experienced Laban's betrayals of trust and revision of agreements, he was feeling what Isaac must have felt upon discovering that his blessing had been stolen through elaborate fraud. The God who had promised to be with Jacob was using even the difficult circumstances of his exile to reshape his character. The young man who had left Canaan believing that success came through superior cunning was slowly learning that true prosperity might require different qualities entirely: integrity, faithfulness, dependence on divine favour rather than human schemes. Yet Jacob remained fundamentally Jacob throughout these years. He continued to look for advantages, continued to devise strategies for increasing his wealth and protecting his interests. The difference was that he was now operating from a position of vulnerability rather than strength, serving under someone else's authority rather than manipulating from a position of family privilege. As the years accumulated and Jacob's household grew through the births of his sons, he began to sense that his time in Haran was approaching its end. The 11 boys born to him during this period, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, and Joseph, represented the beginning of what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Each birth was a step toward the fulfillment of God's promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the dust of the earth. But the growing size and complexity of Jacob's household also created new tensions with Laban and his sons. What had once been a mutually beneficial arrangement was becoming a source of resentment as Jacob's prosperity began to overshadow that of his host family. Laban's sons began to grumble that Jacob was taking what rightfully belonged to them, that their father's wealth was being diverted to this foreign relative who had arrived with nothing but had somehow prospered beyond all reasonable expectation. "Jacob has taken all that was our father's," they complained, "and from what was our father's, he has gained all this wealth." The accusation carried the sting of partial truth. Jacob had indeed become wealthy while in Laban's service. though through his own skill and apparent divine blessing rather than through theft or deception. Jacob could sense the changing atmosphere in Laban's household, could see how his uncle's attitude toward him was cooling despite his continued valuable service. The welcome that had once been warm was becoming grudging. The appreciation for his contributions was being replaced by suspicion and resentment. After 20 years in Haran, Jacob was beginning to feel like an unwelcome guest overstaying his visit. It was in this context of growing tension that God spoke to Jacob again, not in a dramatic vision like at Bethel, but with clear and unmistakable divine direction. "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." The command was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling because it meant the end of exile, the possibility of return to the land of promise, the chance to see his aging parents before they died. Terrifying because it meant facing Esau, whose last words had been a vow to kill the brother who had stolen his birthright and blessing. 20 years had passed since Jacob's hasty departure. Was it enough time for wounds to heal and anger to cool, or had Esau spent those decades nurturing his hatred and planning his revenge? Jacob understood that his time of preparation was ending. The years in Haran had changed him, not completely, not into someone unrecognizable, but enough to make him a different man from the one who had fled his brother's wrath. He had learned what it meant to be deceived, to be vulnerable, to depend on divine favor rather than purely on human cleverness. He had experienced love, fatherhood, and the complex dynamics of managing a large household. Most importantly, he had learned that the God of his fathers was indeed faithful to his promises, that divine blessing could not be thwarted by human manipulation, and that the covenant made with Abraham would advance through the generations regardless of the failures and schemes of its human participants. As Jacob contemplated the return journey, he understood that he was about to face the greatest test of his transformation. Could the man who had stolen Esau's blessing 20 years earlier now face his brother with humility and hope for reconciliation? Could the heir of Abraham's promises find a way to claim his inheritance without destroying the family relationships that gave it meaning? The road home to Canaan would provide the answer. But first, Jacob would have to navigate the delicate process of leaving Laban without triggering the kind of confrontation that could endanger his wives, children, and accumulated wealth. The master manipulator was about to face his greatest challenge, escaping from an even greater master manipulator while protecting everything he had gained during his years of exile. The command to return home had come from God with unmistakable clarity, but implementing divine directives in the face of human complications required all of Jacob's strategic thinking, and then some. After 20 years of building wealth and family under Laban's roof, he couldn't simply announce his departure and expect his uncle to wave farewell with a smile. Too much was at stake. Laban's prosperity had become inextricably linked to Jacob's presence, and men like Laban didn't release valuable assets without a fight. Jacob began by testing the waters, calling Rachel and Leah to meet him privately in the fields where his flocks grazed, away from the listening ears of Laban's household. The location itself was significant, out among the sheep and goats that had multiplied so remarkably under Jacob's care, surrounded by the tangible evidence of the blessing that had followed him even in exile. "I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before," Jacob told his wives carefully. "But the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not permit him to harm me." The accusation of being cheated 10 times wasn't hyperbole. Laban had indeed repeatedly altered the terms of Jacob's compensation, always in ways that seemed to favour himself. When Jacob's wages were supposed to be all the speckled animals, Laban would remove the speckled ones before Jacob could claim them. When the terms were changed to favour striped animals, somehow the striped ones would disappear from the flocks. It was manipulation so systematic and shameless that it would have destroyed a lesser man's prosperity entirely. But Jacob had learned to trust in something beyond his uncle's fairness or his own cleverness. If he said, "The spotted shall be your wages," then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, "The striped shall be your wages," then all the flock bore striped, Jacob explained to his wives. "God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me." The divine intervention in the breeding patterns had been so obvious, so consistently favourable to Jacob despite Laban's attempts at manipulation, that even Rachel and Leah could see that some power greater than human cunning was at work. Their father's wealth was being transferred to their husband not through theft or deception, but through the inexplicable blessing that seemed to follow Jacob wherever he went. Jacob then shared with them a dream he had received, a vision that had provided both explanation and instruction for his unusual success. In the dream, he had seen that all the male animals mating with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled, exactly the characteristics that Laban had tried to deny him as wages. An angel of God had spoken to him in the dream, saying, "I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land and return to the land of your kindred." The message was clear. God had been orchestrating Jacob's prosperity despite Laban's manipulations, and now it was time to leave. But the practical challenges of departure remained enormous. Jacob's household now included 2 wives, their servants Bilhah and Zilpah, 11 sons, at least 1 daughter, and flocks so vast that they required dozens of shepherds to manage. Moving such an enterprise required careful planning and perfect timing. Rachel and Leah's response to Jacob's proposal revealed how thoroughly their loyalties had shifted over the years. "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house?" they asked rhetorically. "Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money." Their bitterness toward Laban was complete and justified. In ancient culture, fathers were expected to preserve bride price payments as inheritance for their daughters, but Laban had clearly spent everything Jacob had given through his 14 years of service. The wealth that God had given to Jacob was rightfully theirs as well, compensation for years of their father's exploitation. "Now then, whatever God has said to you, do," they concluded, giving Jacob their full support for whatever plan he might devise. The escape required timing that would have impressed any military strategist. Jacob waited until Laban departed for the annual sheep shearing, a festival that typically lasted several days and would take him a significant distance from home. Sheep shearing was both economic necessity and social celebration, requiring Laban's presence to oversee the work and maintain relationships with neighbouring pastoralists. As soon as Laban's party disappeared over the horizon, Jacob implemented a plan that had probably been months in the making. He gathered his children, loaded his wives and possessions onto camels, and began driving his enormous flocks toward the Jordan River and the land of Canaan beyond. The logistics alone were staggering, organising hundreds of animals, dozens of people, and all their accumulated possessions into a mobile caravan that could move quickly enough to maintain a head start over pursuit. But even as the escape proceeded with military precision, it carried within it the seeds of future complications. Unknown to Jacob, Rachel had committed an act that would nearly destroy everything they were attempting to accomplish. She had stolen her father's household gods, small figurines called teraphim that represented both spiritual authority and legal claim to inheritance. These weren't merely religious objects, but symbols of family headship and inheritance rights. In Mesopotamian law, possession of household gods often determined who could claim the family estate after the patriarch's death. Rachel's theft was thus both spiritual rebellion against her father's paganism and practical attempt to secure her husband's legal claim to Laban's wealth. 3 days passed before Laban discovered that Jacob had fled with his daughters, grandchildren, and a significant portion of what had once been Laban's livestock. The delay gave Jacob's caravan a crucial head start, but it also meant that when Laban learned of the escape, his anger had time to build to explosive levels. Laban immediately organised a pursuit party, gathering his kinsmen and servants for a chase that would cover hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. For 7 days they rode hard, following the tracks of Jacob's massive caravan, gaining ground steadily on the heavily laden fugitives. The pursuit must have felt relentless to Jacob. Each day brought the possibility that they would see dust clouds on their back trail. Each night carried the fear that dawn would reveal Laban's party surrounding their camp. But on the night before Laban caught up with them, God intervened in a way that probably saved Jacob's life, and certainly prevented a confrontation that could have ended in bloodshed. The Lord appeared to Laban in a dream, delivering a warning that was both clear and ominous. Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. The divine intervention was perfectly timed and precisely targeted. God wasn't preventing Laban from catching up with Jacob. That was inevitable given the speed of mounted pursuit versus heavily loaded caravan. But he was constraining what Laban could do once the confrontation occurred, limiting his options in ways that would protect Jacob and his family from the worst of his uncle's wrath. When Laban finally overtook Jacob's caravan in the hill country of Gilead, the stage was set for a confrontation that could have ended in violence, legal battle, or family destruction. Jacob had been caught red-handed fleeing with what Laban considered stolen property, taking daughters and grandchildren without permission, violating every norm of ancient hospitality and family obligation. "What have you done?" Laban demanded. "That you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre?" The accusation mixed legitimate grievance with typical Laban manipulation. Yes, Jacob had departed secretly, but the idea that Laban would have organised a joyful farewell celebration was laughable, given the 20 years of exploitation that had preceded it. Still, Jacob's method of departure did violate cultural norms that required formal leave-taking and family consultation. But Laban's most serious charge was yet to come. "Why did you steal my gods?" The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Jacob knew nothing of Rachel's theft, and his response carried the ring of genuine innocence and righteous indignation. "Anyone with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours and take it." The oath was rash, spoken in the heat of anger and the confidence of innocence, but it placed Rachel's life in mortal danger. If the stolen gods were discovered in her possession, Jacob's own words would condemn her to death. What followed was a tense search of the entire caravan, tent by tent, possession by possession, with Laban examining everything he could find while Jacob watched in growing confidence that his uncle's accusations would be proven false. The search proceeded systematically. Laban checked Jacob's tent, then Leah's, then the servants' quarters, finding nothing. Finally he came to Rachel's tent where the stolen gods lay hidden beneath the camel's saddle she was sitting on. Rachel, displaying the same quick thinking that had characterized her family for generations, played the perfect innocent while concealing her crime through a clever deception of her own. "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you," she told her father sweetly, "for the way of women is upon me." She was claiming to be in the midst of her monthly cycle, which would make her ceremonially unclean and provide perfect justification for remaining seated while her father searched around her. Laban, constrained by cultural taboos surrounding women's cycles and finding nothing else in the tent, finally concluded his search empty-handed. The stolen gods remained hidden, Rachel's theft went undetected, and Jacob's angry protestations of innocence seemed vindicated by the failure to find any stolen property. The moment when Laban's search ended empty-handed marked a turning point in the confrontation. Jacob, his innocence apparently proven and his anger fully justified, launched into a speech that 20 years of accumulated grievances had been building toward. "What is my offence? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me?" he demanded. "You have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two." The words carried the formal challenge of a man demanding justice before witnesses, appealing to the ancient codes of fairness that governed relationships even between family members. Jacob was no longer the fugitive caught in flight. He was the wrongly accused party demanding vindication. "These 20 years I have been with you," Jacob continued, his voice rising with passion. "Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night." Each accusation hit its mark because each was demonstrably true. Jacob had served Laban with a level of faithfulness that exceeded what any contract required, absorbing losses that should have been shared, taking responsibility for problems beyond any reasonable person's control. His service had been exemplary by any standard of measurement. There I was. By day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes, Jacob recounted, painting a picture of 20 years of hardship endured for his uncle's benefit. "These 20 years I have served in your house, 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. The indictment was complete and devastating. Laban stood accused before his own kinsmen and Jacob's household of systematic exploitation, contract manipulation, and violation of the basic fairness that should govern family relationships. Worse, he had been caught in a false accusation of theft, undermining his credibility and justifying Jacob's anger. But Jacob's most powerful statement was yet to come. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, had not been on my side, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labour of my hands and rebuked you last night. Here was Jacob acknowledging what he had learned during his years in Haran, that his prosperity had come not through his own cleverness, but through divine blessing, that his protection from Laban's worst manipulations had been supernatural rather than natural, that the God of his fathers had been with him exactly as promised at Bethel. Faced with Jacob's justified anger, the failure of his accusation of theft, and the divine warning he had received in his dream, Laban shifted tactics with the smooth adaptability of an experienced negotiator. Rather than continuing the confrontation, he proposed a covenant, a formal agreement that would allow both parties to separate with honour intact and future conflicts prevented. "Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I," Laban proposed, "and let it be a witness between you and me." What followed was an ancient treaty-making ceremony that formalised the end of Jacob's 20-year servitude and established the terms under which he could depart in peace. They gathered stones to build a heap, creating a physical monument to their agreement that would endure long after both men had died. Jacob called the heap Galid, meaning heap of witness, while Laban used the Aramaic equivalent Jegar Sahadutha. The covenant terms were simple but comprehensive. The stone heap would serve as a boundary marker. Neither man would pass beyond it to harm the other. Laban acknowledged Jacob's right to take his daughters and their children, while Jacob committed to treating his wives well and taking no additional wives beyond those he already had. Most significantly, both men invoked divine oversight of their agreement. "The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us," Laban declared, appealing to the shared ancestry that connected them despite their conflicts. Jacob swore by the fear of Isaac, his preferred title for the God he'd come to know during his years of exile. They sealed the covenant with sacrificial offerings and a shared meal, the ancient ritual that transformed enemies into parties bound by sacred obligation. The meal was both celebration and solemnization, marking the end of one chapter in Jacob's life and the beginning of another. When dawn broke over the hill country of Gilead, Laban rose early, kissed his daughters and grandchildren farewell, blessed them, and departed for Haran. The parting was surprisingly peaceful, given the tensions that had brought them to this point, testament to both the divine intervention that had prevented violence and the covenant that now protected both parties. Jacob was free. After 20 years of service, manipulation, and gradual character development, he was finally able to resume the journey toward his destiny that had been interrupted by his flight from Esau's wrath. His caravan was now enormous. 2 wives, their servants, 11 sons, at least 1 daughter, and flocks so vast that they stretched across the landscape like a moving city. But freedom brought with it a new and even more terrifying challenge. Ahead lay the land of Canaan and the inevitable encounter with Esau. 20 years had passed since Jacob's hasty departure, 20 years during which he had often wondered whether his brother's anger had cooled or intensified. Had Esau forgotten his vow of revenge, or had he spent 2 decades nurturing his hatred and planning the perfect opportunity for retaliation? As Jacob's caravan moved south toward the Jordan River, he must have felt the weight of approaching destiny with every step. Behind him lay the relative safety of exile, the predictable rhythms of service to Laban, the gradual accumulation of wealth and family under foreign protection. Ahead lay the land of promise, but also the reckoning with past deceptions that could no longer be avoided. The man who had once believed that every problem could be solved through superior strategy was about to face a situation that would require something he had never truly possessed: the willingness to surrender control and trust in something greater than his own abilities. The journey home would force Jacob to confront not just his brother's wrath, but his own deepest fears about identity, worthiness, and what it truly meant to be the inheritor of Abraham's covenant. God had been faithful to his promise at Bethel. He had been with Jacob throughout his exile, had protected him from Laban's worst manipulations, had prospered him beyond anything he could have achieved through his own efforts. Now Jacob would discover whether that same divine faithfulness could bridge the chasm of broken relationships and transform an ancient wound into the foundation for reconciliation. The road ahead led toward the Jabbok River, toward an encounter that would change Jacob's name and nature, toward a wrestling match that would finally complete the transformation that had begun with a dream on a stone pillow at Bethel. But first, he would have to face the brother he had wronged, carrying with him nothing but hope for forgiveness and trust in the God who had never failed to keep his promises. As the caravan crossed into the territory where Esau now lived, Jacob began to hear reports from travelling merchants and nomadic tribes about his brother's circumstances. Esau had not languished in defeat during Jacob's absence. Instead, he had built his own kingdom in the hill country of Seir, southeast of the Dead Sea. He commanded 400 armed men, not a small family band, but a significant military force capable of serious warfare. The news was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it suggested that Esau had prospered in his own right, had built a life and legacy that might make him less resentful of what Jacob had taken from him decades earlier. Terrifying because 400 armed men represented overwhelming military superiority that could crush Jacob's caravan without serious resistance. Jacob understood that he was approaching the most crucial test of his transformation. Everything he had learned about humility, dependence on God, and the futility of pure human manipulation would be put to the ultimate examination. Could the man who had stolen his brother's blessing find a way to face that brother with integrity and hope for reconciliation? The answer would come at a river crossing, on a night when Jacob would finally encounter an opponent he could not outmaneuver, a struggle he could not win through cleverness, and a blessing that could only be received through surrender. The heel grabber was about to become the God wrestler, but first he would have to learn that some victories can only be achieved through the willingness to lose everything you think you cannot live without. As his caravan approached the borders of Esau's territory, Jacob began to understand that all his years of preparation, the humbling in Laban's house, the lessons in deception received rather than given, the gradual recognition of divine faithfulness, had been leading toward this moment. The question was no longer whether he was clever enough to outmaneuver his brother, but whether he had been changed enough to face him with honesty, humility, and hope for the kind of reconciliation that only God could orchestrate. The journey that had begun with a young man fleeing consequences was about to culminate with a mature patriarch seeking redemption. But between Jacob and that redemption lay a night of wrestling that would finally answer the question of who he truly was and who he was meant to become. The messengers Jacob had sent ahead to announce his return came racing back across the dusty plains with news that turned his blood to ice water in his veins. "We came to your brother Esau," they reported breathlessly, "and he is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him." 400 men. The number reverberated through Jacob's mind like a death knell. This wasn't a brother coming to welcome a long-lost sibling home. This was a military commander approaching with enough force to annihilate Jacob's entire caravan. Every worst fear that had haunted Jacob during his 20 years of exile suddenly seemed prophetic. Esau had not forgotten. Esau had not forgiven. And now Esau was coming with the means to extract the revenge he had promised 2 decades earlier. Terror gripped Jacob with an intensity he had never experienced, not even during his desperate flight from Canaan or his most difficult days under Laban's manipulation. This fear cut deeper than concern for his own safety. It encompassed his wives, his children, the servants who depended on him, the vast flocks that represented 20 years of careful accumulation. Everything he had built, everyone he loved, everything that gave his life meaning was about to be swept away by the consequences of decisions he had made when he was young and clever and convinced that he could outsmart anyone. But the crisis also revealed how much Jacob had changed during his years of exile. The young man who had fled Canaan might have simply turned around and run deeper into the wilderness, abandoning anyone who couldn't keep up and trusting to his own speed and cunning to escape. The mature patriarch who now faced this threat responded with a combination of practical strategy and spiritual desperation, that showed how profoundly his understanding of both human limitations and divine power had evolved. Jacob's first response was entirely characteristic. He divided his people and possessions into two camps, reasoning that if Esau attacked and destroyed one group, the other might escape to preserve some remnant of his family. It was sound military strategy, the kind of practical planning that had served him well throughout his life. But even as he organized this desperate contingency plan, Jacob understood that human wisdom alone would not be sufficient for what lay ahead. His second response revealed the depth of his transformation. The man who had once treated God as a potential negotiating partner now threw himself on divine mercy with a prayer that was both desperate and profound, acknowledging both his unworthiness and God's faithfulness in language that marked him as fundamentally changed from the scheming young man who had fled Esau's wrath. "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac," Jacob began, establishing his appeal on the foundation of covenant relationship rather than personal merit. "O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and to your kindred, and I will prosper you,' I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant." The acknowledgement of unworthiness was revolutionary coming from Jacob's lips. This was the man who had spent his early life believing he deserved everything he could take through superior cunning, who had treated divine blessing as something to be seized rather than received. Now he was confessing that even the least of God's mercies exceeded anything he had earned or could claim by right. "With only my staff I crossed this Jordan," Jacob continued, his voice breaking with the memory of how far God's grace had carried him. "And now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children." The prayer revealed both Jacob's continued human fear and his growing understanding of divine character. He was honest about his terror, frank about his need for protection he could not provide for himself, yet confident enough in God's nature to appeal for mercy on behalf of the most vulnerable members of his household. "But you said, 'I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude,'" Jacob concluded, anchoring his appeal not in his own worthiness, but in God's previous promises. He was learning to rest his hope on divine faithfulness rather than human merit, to trust in covenant promises rather than personal cleverness. Yet even as Jacob poured out his heart in prayer, his strategic mind continued working on practical solutions. If Esau was approaching with military force, perhaps that force could be neutralized through overwhelming generosity rather than matching violence. Jacob began selecting gifts from his vast herds, an enormous tribute that would demonstrate both his prosperity and his peaceful intentions. The gifts he chose were staggering in their scope and careful in their psychological calculation. 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. It was wealth that represented years of patient accumulation, animals chosen to demonstrate that Jacob had prospered magnificently during his exile, and was willing to share that prosperity generously with the brother he had wronged. But Jacob's genius lay not just in the size of the gift, but in its presentation. Rather than sending everything at once in a massive herd that might seem like an attempt to buy forgiveness, he divided the animals into separate groups, spacing them out so that Esau would encounter wave after wave of tribute, each one delivered with the same message: "They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a present sent to my lord Esau, and moreover, he is behind us." The psychological impact would be enormous. As Esau and his 400 men approached, they would encounter the first group of animals with their attendants explaining that these were gifts from Jacob. Before they could fully process the implications, they would encounter a second group, then a third, then a fourth. By the time all the gifts had been presented, Esau would understand that his brother was approaching not as a rival or threat, but as a penitent seeking reconciliation. "I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me," Jacob reasoned, "and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me." The Hebrew word for appease literally means to cover, or to atone. Jacob was hoping that his gifts would somehow cover or compensate for the wrongs he had committed decades earlier. As night fell and the gifts departed for their mission, Jacob was left with the reduced company of his immediate family and closest servants. The caravan that had seemed so large and prosperous in the morning now felt small and vulnerable in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring the encounter with Esau, the moment when 20 years of consequences would finally catch up with 20 minutes of deception. Jacob moved his family across the ford of the Jabbok River, getting them to what he hoped would be relative safety on the far side, while he remained alone on the near bank to face whatever was coming. The river crossing was both practical strategy, putting a natural barrier between his family and potential danger, and symbolic transition. Jacob was crossing from his past into his future, from exile into inheritance, from the person he had been into the person he was becoming. But as his family disappeared into the darkness on the far side of the Jabbok, as the sound of their voices faded and the night settled around him with oppressive silence, Jacob found himself facing something he had avoided throughout his entire life: complete solitude with nothing but his own thoughts and fears for company. The successful strategist, the master manipulator, the man who had always been able to talk or scheme his way out of difficult situations, was finally alone with the consequences of his choices and the uncertainty of his future. Tomorrow he would face Esau, but tonight he had to face himself, and in doing so, he would encounter the God who had been waiting 20 years for Jacob to stop running long enough to be transformed. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability, when Jacob had exhausted his human resources and stood naked before the future, with nothing but hope in divine mercy, that the most extraordinary encounter in biblical history began to unfold. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man, yet somehow more than a man, approaching with purpose that seemed both mysterious and inevitable. Jacob, his nerves stretched to the breaking point by fear and anticipation, might have expected to face a messenger from Esau, or perhaps bandits seeking to take advantage of his isolation. What he did not expect was to find himself grappling with a being whose identity would remain mysterious throughout the struggle that followed, yet whose presence carried the unmistakable weight of divine authority. The wrestling match that ensued was unlike anything in human experience before or since. It was simultaneously physical and spiritual, a contest of strength that was also a battle for identity, a fight that was also a prayer, a struggle that would transform both combatants before the sun rose to illuminate the changed landscape of Jacob's soul. For hours they grappled in the darkness beside the Jabbok, two figures locked in combat that seemed to encompass every struggle Jacob had ever fought, with his brother, with his uncle, with his own nature, with the question of who he truly was and who he was meant to become. The physical contest was real enough. Jacob's muscles strained against his opponent's strength, his lungs burned with exertion, his body was pushed to limits he didn't know he possessed. But this was no ordinary wrestling match. Jacob's opponent could have ended the struggle at any moment. The touch to Jacob's hip that finally dislocated the joint proved that supernatural power was being deliberately restrained throughout the encounter. This was not a fight to determine the stronger combatant, but a spiritual exercise designed to bring Jacob to the end of his own strength and the beginning of dependence on divine grace. As the hours passed and dawn approached, Jacob began to understand that he was fighting not just for physical victory, but for spiritual breakthrough. This mysterious wrestler represented everything Jacob had been struggling against his entire life: the resistance of reality to his manipulations, the refusal of blessing to be seized through human effort, the stubborn insistence of truth that some gifts can only be received through surrender. When the divine wrestler touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it with supernatural ease, the physical pain was immediate and devastating. But the spiritual significance was even greater. Jacob was being marked, wounded in a way that would remind him for the rest of his life that this encounter had changed him permanently and irreversibly. "Let me go, for the day is breaking," the wrestler said, his urgency suggesting that the approaching dawn would end the opportunity for this kind of intimate divine encounter. But Jacob, despite his injury, despite his exhaustion, despite his recognition that he was overmatched, refused to release his grip. Everything he had learned during 20 years of exile culminated in this moment of desperate spiritual hunger. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he declared, his words carrying the weight of a lifetime's pursuit of divine favour. It was the most important statement Jacob had ever made. Here was the man who had spent his youth trying to steal blessings finally learning to ask for them properly. Here was the heel grabber holding on not to trip up an opponent but to receive what could only be given freely. Here was the transformation that Bethel had begun, and Haran had developed, finally reaching completion in the darkness beside the Jabbok. "What is your name?" the wrestler asked. The question forced Jacob to confront his identity with brutal honesty. He could no longer hide behind clever schemes or pretend to be someone else, as he had when deceiving Isaac. In the presence of this divine opponent, deception was impossible and pretense was useless. "Jacob," he answered, speaking his name and acknowledging everything it represented: supplanter, deceiver, heel grabber, the one who takes what belongs to others. "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel," came the response that would echo through history. "For you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." The new name carried transformative power. Israel meant he who strives with God, or God strives. It captured both Jacob's persistent wrestling with divine purposes and God's own wrestling with human stubbornness to bring about transformation. Jacob the supplanter was dying in the darkness beside the Jabbok. Israel the patriarch was being born. But even in this moment of ultimate revelation, mystery remained. When Jacob asked, "Please tell me your name," the wrestler's response preserved the divine prerogative. "Why do you ask my name?" Some truths are too great for human comprehension, some encounters too sacred for complete understanding. Instead of revealing his identity directly, the mysterious wrestler blessed Jacob there beside the river, confirming the name change and all its implications. The blessing was what Jacob had been seeking his entire life. Not the stolen blessing of Isaac, not the manipulated advantages gained through deception, but the freely given favour of God himself. As dawn broke over the Jabbok ford, Jacob found himself alone again, but he was no longer the same man who had wrestled through the night. He named the place Peniel, face of God, because, as he said in wonder, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The encounter had been as real as the dislocated hip that would cause him to limp for the rest of his days, yet as mysterious as the identity of the wrestler who had disappeared with the darkness. The sun rose on a man transformed. Jacob had finally stopped running. From his brother, from his past, from the consequences of his choices. He had learned to hold on to God with the same tenacity he had once used to grasp human advantages, and in doing so he had discovered that divine blessing was worth more than anything he had ever stolen or manipulated his way into receiving. Israel, for that was his name now, rose from beside the Jabbok and prepared to face his brother. The limp that marked his steps would remind him with every footfall that some victories leave permanent marks, that transformation comes through struggle, and that the God who had wrestled with him through the night would be with him through whatever the day might bring. Behind him lay the old life of Jacob the supplanter. Ahead lay the new destiny of Israel the patriarch. But first there was a brother to face, a relationship to restore, and a demonstration to give of just how completely the heel grabber had been transformed into a man of God. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Jabbok ford as Israel, no longer Jacob in name or nature, prepared to face the brother he had wronged 20 years earlier. The limp that marked every step served as a constant reminder of the night that had changed everything, but it was the transformation of his heart that would truly be tested in the hours ahead. As Israel looked across the landscape toward the approaching dust cloud that marked Esau's advance, he could make out the details that confirmed his worst fears and his greatest hopes simultaneously. 400 men indeed rode with his brother, their spears glinting in the morning light, their formation disciplined enough to suggest serious military capability. But at their head rode Esau himself, and something in his bearing suggested that this was not an army bent on slaughter, but a leader coming to meet an equal. Israel arranged his family with careful deliberation, placing the servants and their children first, then Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph last, protecting those most precious to him while ensuring that if violence erupted he would be the first to face it. But his arrangement was not just strategic, it was also ceremonial, the formal presentation of his household to the brother whose forgiveness he desperately sought. When Esau came within sight, Israel stepped forward alone, leaving his family behind as he had left them on the far side of the Jabbok. But instead of advancing with the confidence of a returning patriarch or the defiance of a man prepared to fight for his life, Israel did something that would have been unthinkable for the young Jacob who had fled Canaan 2 decades earlier. He bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. 7 times. Each bow was a complete prostration, the kind of submission that subjects showed to kings, that vassals offered to overlords, that penitents presented to those they had grievously wronged. Israel was not approaching as an equal seeking reconciliation between peers. He was coming as a humble suppliant acknowledging both his guilt and his brother's right to forgiveness or revenge. The sight of his brother's abasement had an immediate and unexpected effect on Esau. Instead of the cold calculation that might have been expected from a man nursing 20 years of resentment, instead of the military posturing that 400 armed men might have encouraged, Esau responded with an emotion that caught everyone by surprise. He ran toward Israel with the eagerness of a man who had been waiting decades for this moment not to exact revenge, but to restore relationship. When he reached his brother, still prostrate on the ground, Esau threw his arms around Israel's neck and kissed him, and both brothers wept with the raw emotion of reconciliation too long delayed. The tears that flowed were not just personal, but generational. They washed away 20 years of separation, dissolved the poison of ancient resentments, and began the healing of wounds that had infected an entire family system. The brother who had sworn to kill Jacob was embracing Israel with the love that had always been there beneath the hurt and anger. "Who are these with you?" Esau asked, looking past his brother to the assembled family that represented Israel's 20 years of exile and blessing. "The children whom God has graciously given your servant," Israel replied, his language carefully chosen to acknowledge both divine favour and his continued humility before his brother. One by one, Israel's family approached to pay their respects to Esau. The servants and their children bowed respectfully, then Leah and her children, and finally Rachel and Joseph. Each greeting was an acknowledgement of Esau's position and a demonstration of Israel's desire for peace rather than continued conflict. But Esau's next question revealed that the gifts Israel had sent ahead had achieved their intended purpose. "What do you mean by all this company that I met?" "To find favour in the sight of my Lord," Israel answered, his words carrying the weight of genuine repentance and hope for restored relationship. Esau's response was magnificent in its generosity. "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." The words carried layers of meaning that both brothers understood perfectly. Esau was not just refusing the gifts, he was declaring that his prosperity was sufficient, that he harboured no resentment over the material blessings Jacob had received, that revenge was unnecessary because blessing was not a zero-sum game where one brother's gain required another's loss. But Israel pressed the gifts upon his brother with an insistence that revealed the depth of his transformation. "Please, if I have found favour in your sight, then accept my present from my hand. For I have seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God, and you have accepted me." The comparison was breathtaking in its theological implications. Israel was saying that Esau's forgiveness was a reflection of divine grace, that the acceptance he had received from his brother mirrored the acceptance he had received from God beside the Jabbok. The face of God that he had encountered in wrestling was somehow reflected in the face of the brother who chose mercy over revenge. "Please accept my blessing that is brought to you," Israel continued, "because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough." The irony was profound and intentional. Israel was asking Esau to accept his blessing, using the same Hebrew word that had been the source of their original conflict. The blessing that had been stolen through deception was now being freely shared through grace. What had once divided them was becoming the foundation for restored relationship. Esau accepted the gifts, and with them, the reconciliation they represented. The 400 men who had seemed to herald destruction became an honor guard celebrating reunion. The brother who had vowed murder became the agent of grace that reflected divine forgiveness. But even in this moment of triumph, the transformation was not yet complete. Esau, in his newfound generosity, invited Israel to travel with him, to return to Seir where they could rebuild their relationship and perhaps reclaim something of the brotherhood that deception had destroyed. Israel's response revealed both continued wisdom and the recognition that some relationships, however restored, could not simply return to their original state. "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. The practical concern was real. Israel's household included nursing mothers, small children, and animals that required careful pace and frequent rest. But there was also a deeper wisdom at work. Israel understood that reconciliation didn't require identical lives or constant proximity. They could be brothers again without being the same kind of brothers they had been in their youth. "Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant," Israel concluded, "and I will lead on slowly, at the pace of the livestock that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my Lord in Seir." It was a diplomatic way of saying that they would remain connected but separate. Brothers who loved each other but lived in different territories, united by blood and forgiveness, but not by geography or lifestyle. Esau accepted this arrangement with the grace that had marked his entire response to Israel's return. After Esau departed with his men, Israel continued his journey into Canaan proper, but his first destination was not the family homestead at Hebron, where his aging father Isaac still lived. Instead, he returned to Bethel, the place where his transformation had begun with a dream of angels ascending and descending a heavenly stairway. The return to Bethel was both pilgrimage and fulfillment of an ancient vow. Years earlier, the young Jacob had promised that if God brought him home safely, he would return to worship at the place where divine promises had first been revealed to him. Now Israel came back not as a fleeing fugitive, but as a prosperous patriarch, not as someone trying to bargain with God, but as someone grateful for divine faithfulness beyond anything he could have imagined. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him, the text records with simple profundity. The God who had wrestled with him beside the Jabbok now appeared to confirm both his new name and his covenant inheritance. "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." The confirmation was necessary because transformation, even divine transformation, requires time to become fully integrated into human personality and behavior. Israel needed to hear again that his identity had truly changed, that he was no longer defined by his past failures but by his present relationship with the God who had chosen him despite his unworthiness. The years that followed brought both profound joy and devastating loss. Rachel, the love of Israel's life, died giving birth to their second son, Benjamin, whose birth completed the 12 sons who would become the heads of the 12 tribes. Her death beside the road to Bethlehem was perhaps the greatest sorrow of Israel's life, the reminder that even transformed men living under divine blessing still faced the common human experiences of loss and grief. Isaac's death brought Israel and Esau together again for their father's burial, a reunion that demonstrated the permanence of their reconciliation. Together they laid Isaac to rest in the cave of Machpelah beside Abraham and Sarah, Rebekah and Leah, the family burial ground that connected them to the covenant promises that had shaped their entire family's destiny. But the most severe test of Israel's transformation came through his relationship with his son Joseph, Rachel's firstborn and the child of his old age. The favoritism that had poisoned Israel's own childhood began to repeat itself in the next generation as he lavished special attention on Joseph, even creating for him a distinctive robe that marked him as the favoured heir among his brothers. The cycle of family dysfunction that had driven Israel from his homeland threatened to repeat itself when Joseph's brothers, consumed with jealousy over their father's favouritism, sold Joseph into slavery and deceived Israel into believing his beloved son had been killed by wild animals. The coat of many colours, torn and bloodied, became the instrument of deception used against Israel, just as he had once used deception against his own father. For years, Israel mourned Joseph as dead, unaware that his son was not only alive but rising to unprecedented power in Egypt as Pharaoh's chief administrator. When famine finally struck Canaan and forced Israel's family to seek grain in Egypt, the revelation that Joseph was alive and the reunion that followed represented perhaps the greatest joy of Israel's entire life. The journey to Egypt in his old age allowed Israel to see the ultimate fulfillment of promises that had sustained him through decades of struggle. His family had indeed multiplied into something approaching a small nation, his sons had become the heads of distinct tribes, and his descendants were positioned to fulfill the ancient promise that through Abraham's seed all the families of the earth would be blessed. But perhaps more importantly, the reunion with Joseph allowed Israel to see how God's providence had worked through even the worst betrayals and deceptions to accomplish divine purposes. Joseph's enslavement, which had seemed like family catastrophe, had positioned him to save not just his own family but entire populations from famine. What man meant for evil, God had transformed into the preservation of life. In his final years living in the land of Goshen under Pharaoh's protection, Israel gathered his sons around him to speak blessings that were also prophecies, insights into the future that each of their tribal descendants would experience. To Reuben, the firstborn who had forfeited his primacy through moral failure. To Simeon and Levi, whose violence would scatter them throughout Israel. To Judah, through whom the royal line would flow until Messiah came. Each blessing revealed Israel's understanding of his son's characters and destinies, but they also revealed his own transformation from the young man who had stolen blessings to the patriarch, who could speak them with divine authority. The words he pronounced over his sons carried the weight of covenant promises and paternal wisdom earned through decades of struggle and growth. "I am about to be gathered to my people," Israel told his sons as his strength finally began to fail. "Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan." The request was both practical and symbolic. Practical because it ensured that his body would rest beside Abraham and Isaac in the land of promise rather than in Egypt where he was dying. Symbolic because it declared his continued faith that his descendants would inherit Canaan despite their current residence in foreign territory. When Israel breathed his last, he died not as Jacob the supplanter, but as Israel the patriarch, the man who had wrestled with God and prevailed, the father of 12 tribes who would inherit the earth, the transformed heir of promises that would shape human history until the end of time. His legacy was not the birthright he had stolen or the blessing he had obtained through deception, but the nation that bore his name and the demonstration that God could transform even the most flawed human material into instruments of divine purpose. The heel-grabber had become the father of a people. The deceiver had become a patriarch. The man who had spent his youth trying to seize divine favor had learned to receive it through surrender and trust. The story of Jacob's transformation from supplanter to Israel remains one of history's most powerful testimonies to the possibility of redemption, the reality of divine grace, and the truth that our past failures need not define our future destinies. In a world where people still struggle with identity, still wrestle with God over questions of purpose and calling, still seek to find their place in divine plans that often seem mysterious or delayed, Israel's journey from Canaan to Haran and back again offers both hope and instruction. The man who began by grasping his brother's heel ended by grasping the blessing of God. The difference between those two kinds of holding on, one motivated by selfish ambition, the other by desperate faith, represents the distance between human manipulation and divine transformation, between trying to seize what we want and learning to receive what God wants to give. Israel's story reminds us that God's purposes advance not despite human failure but often through it, that transformation is possible at any stage of life, and that the wrestling matches we fight with divine purposes, whether in prayer, in crisis, or in the dark nights of the soul, can become very means by which we discover who we truly are and who we were always meant to become.